Today's topic, Tarocco Siciliano, i.e. Sicilian Tarot. What is it? Well, it's a game. That's right, a tarot card game. Tarot cards, including the peculiar Sicilian deck, that's not widely known, however, were originally and are still used for games. Divination is apparently more marketable, but only arose around 4 centuries after tarot cards came about. Sicilian Tarot, as we'll touch upon it today, is obviously a modern game, but it does preserve many an archaic feature. As the name rightly suggests, it's still played in parts of Sicily, the large island in the south of Italy, not Sicily, Illinois. Briefly put, the objective of the game is to take tricks, you could say rounds of cards, but not just the tricks themselves as you do in more popular games, say bridge, spades or euchre. No, it's about capturing specific cards that are worth more card points than others, and also about capturing a few rummy or canasta-like combinations of cards. The most established version that I'll elaborate on today is played by 3 people using 63 cards. What then is the makeup of this deck of 63 cards? Here's a brief look at the most widely available variant printed by Modiano, a popular Italian card printing company. We can already see that there are striking differences to a modern poker deck, say, and we'll get to the specifics in a minute. This is the same layout, but featuring a brand new deck designed by Lelio Bonaccorso and distributed by Salvatore Bonaccorsi. Shout out to you guys. And I'll keep using this particular new deck throughout the video. If you'd like to learn more about Sicilian Tarot and you understand some Italian, do please consider visiting the page of the Associazione Culturale Gioco Tarocchi Siciliani, Michael Domet, Catania. I'll also put a link to it in the video description. Let's begin by having a brief look at the 41 quote-unquote normal cards, the so-called suits. There are 4 suits, the ones we still find in many Spanish, Italian as well as tarot decks. 2 round ones, coins and cups, and 2 straight, long or weapon ones, swords and clubs. The clubs are also sometimes called batons. In each suit there are 4 court cards, kings, queens, cavaliers or knights, and jacks, although the latter are all female maids in Sicilian Tarot. Note the position of the cavaliers that are absent from, say, poker decks, whereas it's actually the queens who are absent from many Spanish or Italian decks. The aforementioned is also their descending order. That means that the king is the strongest card in any suit. All court cards are in turn stronger than the pips, ranging from 10 to 5 in descending order, or from 10 to 4 in the suit of coins exclusively. This anomaly is ultimately due to the attempt of creating a deck of 63 cards, a number divisible by 3, since this, in its purest form, is a 3-player game. Then there are 22 extra cards, very typical of tarot games. These are comprised of 21 trumps and a single fool. I'm trying to stick to English terminology as much as possible, by the way. If you're interested in the Italian, and maybe specifically Sicilian terminology, the aforementioned webpage can constitute a good starting point. There are 21 trumps, numbered from 20 to 0. The 0th trump is misery, in the original deck simply unnumbered. The most outstanding characteristic of the trumps is that they beat any suit card, and they also beat each other, the 20 thus being the highest and unbeatable card in the game. The sequence of the trumps is a peculiar one. I'll briefly touch upon it towards the end of the video. For practical purposes, however, the numerical sequence is quite sufficient. The 22nd card depicted here, the Fool, was originally the lowest of the low trumps, but performs a different function in most tarot games now. We'll get to that before long. This modern version of the Sicilian Tarot has an asterisk for the Fool's Index, a practice reminiscent of the French Tarot, another tarot game very popular in France as we speak. Tarot games are trick-taking games, which means that one player puts a card onto the table, the 2 others follow, and these 3 cards are now out of play and constitute a so-called trick that is now turned face down and gathered up by the winner of the trick, who then leads to the next, and so on, until all cards have been played. The principal obligation is to follow suit. This very expression indeed originated within the context of card games. What that means is that if somebody led a coin card to the trick, all others must also play coins in case they still have any left. The same goes for cups, batons or clubs, swords, and of course also the trumps. The direction of deal and play is, by the way, anti-clockwise, the original way of play, as opposed to most modern games where it's usually clockwise. In case one does not have any coins left in one's hand, but they were still led to the trick one has to trump, This is, hence, one way of drawing trumps. Only if a player is void of the suit that was led, and he does not have any trumps left either, a card of any suit may be discarded. A discard does not have any trick-taking power though. Thus even a discarded queen of a different suit would not beat any lowly number cards and coins. The four different suits exist in parallel dimensions, so to speak. To sum it up, a trick is won by the highest trump played to it, or indeed, if the trick does not contain any trumps at all, the highest card of the suit that was led to the trick. As promised, a few words on the Fool, who is a special card. In some tarot games, its name is actually quite fittingly the Excuse, because this card can be played only once per hand, of course, instead of playing any other card. It's an excuse for not following suit or trumping. Reasons can be manifold. Perhaps one does not want to sacrifice a card to one's opponents, etc. The Fool does not beat anything, but it can also not be beaten, and is hence never lost, a truly wild card. With one notable exception. If one's team does not gather any tricks at all, the Fool will also be lost to the opposing team. Most tarot games conform to the principle of giving an empty card from one's gathered tricks, i.e. one of the numerous cards worth just a single point, we'll get to the point values in a minute, to the opponents, in exchange for the Fool that is kept even if the trick itself was not won. This is traditionally not required in Sicilian Tarot, but it's a good practice to implement anyway. The Fool must not be led to any but the very last trick. Again, it can be played to any trick, but can only ever be led to the very last one, in which case the second card played to the trick will count as the actual lead card, and the trick will thus naturally not be taken by the leader of the Fool. Since, as we shall see, taking the last trick is considered of equal importance to gaining the majority of card points, this is a measure of forcing a player blessed with exceptionally good cards and the Fool to give up the lead at least once in the game, so as not to be coerced into leading the Fool to the last trick, thus losing that valuable game point. The goal of the game is more precisely put, comprised of several goals. These would be, firstly, gathering at least 55 card points in one's team's tricks, as opposed to game points. We'll get to that as well. Secondly, taking the very last trick. Thirdly, gathering up certain combinations of cards in one's team's tricks. And fourthly and lastly, capturing certain valuable cards during play. Let's concentrate on the card points for a while, because this is no trivial matter at all. The basic card points, not the final ones though, are the following. The highest trump, i.e. trump 20, the second to lowest trump, that is trump 1, and the Fool are each worth 10 card points. The four trumps 16 through 19 are each worth 5 card points, thus exactly as many as each king, whereas the queens, knights and maids are worth 4, 3 and 2 card points respectively. All other cards, i.e. the trumps 0 and 2 through 15, as well as the suited number cards, are worth merely 1 card point and are often called empty cards. This would result in a hypothetical total of 146 card points. The actual total is, however, somewhat lower. Let's get to the reason for that. Cards are usually counted by grouping them in triplets of 1 card worth more than 1 card point and 2 empty cards, to chaff, so to speak. And that very triplet is then counted as the value of the one most important card in it. This is exactly why the 1-pointers can be considered empty. There are several methods of achieving the same result. The aforementioned grouping method has proven to be the most popular, but one can also add up the ones for the empty cards and subsequently deduct 2 card points per trick. This latter method is often the only way of counting the last cards, wherein it might not be possible to conveniently group them anymore. These two methods, i.e. the grouping and the subtractive method, can seem rather odd, because originally the values of individual cards were all worth 1 card point less than previously stated, and another card point was simply awarded for each trick of 3 cards one took, thus additionally rewarding the number of tricks. And finally, one might also assume fractions, in which case neither grouping nor subtraction nor addition would be necessary anymore, but one would conversely have to compute more complicated values. Therefore, the grouping method prevails, and the subtraction method, albeit somewhat unwieldy, can then be utilized for any leftover cards, since the values would exactly correspond to the ones already used, whilst grouping the majority of the cards in one's trick pile. So let's assume, for example, that we managed to 2-chaff group all cards but 3, a queen, a cavalier, and a Jackie maid. One would then compute 4 plus 3 plus 2 and subtract 2 for the trick. This result of 7 can of course be arrived at by using either the original or the fractional method, but again the subtractive method has the benefit of using the exact same card point values as the groupie one. All that said, we can now compute the actual total using any of the aforementioned methods and add the conventional value of 5 card points awarded to whoever took the last trick. That brings us to the full count of 109 and thus 55, i.e. barely more than half of 109 card points to win the game. Well, not quite, because we already saw that gathering up the majority of card points is but one of the objectives, and the overall game points are therefore different to just the card points. We'll see a full overview of the game points shortly, but let's proceed with preparing for a game by shuffling a deck and dealing cards now. The dealer, whoever it is, that can be decided on a whim, shuffles the deck and offers it to the person against the direction of play, i.e. to the player seated to his left, to cut. The dealer then completes the cut and may have a look at the now bottommost card for his private information. As mentioned earlier, every substantial activity in the game, such as deal, bidding and play, follows the anti-clockwise direction. Thereupon, the dealer deals only 5 cards to each player, naturally ending with himself. That is, not all cards are dealt at once. Rather, a bidding process ensues now, and is then repeated if applicable, up to 4 times, in which case all 3 players will have been dealt 20 cards each. The bidding process can occasionally terminate even earlier, either because somebody took the game, in which case all cards would be dealt while skipping subsequent bidding, or conversely, because everybody passed, in which case the game is thrown in, reshuffled, and dealt anew. So after any 5 newly dealt cards, a bidding process ensues, which means that one's hand can be evaluated 4 times, even until the game starts at all. This bidding process is essential to determine who will take on the role of the solo player and will thus attempt to win the game against the other 2 players. Bids which can be uttered after any 5 new cards are pass or 5 more. Their meaning is sufficiently transparent. Pass means you don't say anything because your hand cannot be considered overly powerful. In case all 3 players pass in a single round, the cards are gathered up, shuffled and dealt anew, this time by the person to the previous dealer's right. The second bid, 5 more, means you'd like to see how things unravel further after being dealt 5 more cards. As soon as anybody says 5 more, whoever in the round it might be, 5 more cards are dealt by the dealer. Even if players after the player who announced 5 more would have liked to say anything different. This bid is hence a stop bid, if you will. Only twice in the dealing process do the players get the chance to proclaim themselves soloist, after the very first deal as well as after the very last one. Such a bid means it's decided, I'm playing against the other 2 players. If this happens after the first deal of 5 cards, the rest of the cards are immediately dealt and no new bids in the same round or indeed any subsequent rounds are solicited or heard. The name of the game has been called, and as we shall see once more shortly, such an early solo is awarded double points, but is also penalised doubly, so one should either have really good cards or indeed be aware of the risk of gambling. Early solos are therefore rather rare. One's cards are much more conducive to proper evaluation after the last deal, in which case a soloist will usually emerge. Only after the second deal of 5 cards, thus not immediately after the first one more exceptional bid, and the reply thereto is permitted. A player with exceptionally weak cards might decide to propose to end the round by paying exactly 1 game point, not more nor less, and thus be spared a potentially more disastrous outcome, possibly worth several game points. A consolatory bid, if you will. In order for such a proposition to actually end the round, another player sitting after the proponent has to accept it firstly, and no one must say 5 more in the same round. Remember, the 5 more bid immediately leads to dealing another 5 cards, no questions asked, and any payment proposal or its acceptance is void. However, if the third player passes, the game ends and the payment proponent pays 1 single game point only to the person who accepted it, and the cards are shuffled and dealt anew, this time by the person to the previous dealer's right. Let's repeat the main principles here. Any 5 more card bid is effective immediately. No other bids are uttered or heard in that round of the deal. The dealer simply deals 5 more cards to everybody. In case all 3 players pass consecutively in the single dealing round, the game is annulled, and the new dealer shuffles and deals. Similarly, the game ends, but not through annulment, rather by payment, if one player proposed a minimum payment, another one accepted it, and the third one passed. An optional Additional rule, which can be adopted but doesn't have to be, would force the dealer to play a solo in the very last dealing round, in case the other two players passed and the dealer, who naturally speaks last, would rather feel like passing, but the players would like to avoid too many reshuffles. Again, this is at the discretion of the players and should be agreed or disagreed upon beforehand. Now, once all the cards have been dealt and all bids made, one of the players has proclaimed himself soloist, the actual game can commence. At this point, each player should hold exactly 20 cards, and the three last remaining cards should sit face down in the middle of the table, their contents so far unbeknownst to anybody, with the exception of one of them, that the dealer was allowed to peek at right after the deck was cut by the player to his left, if you remember, since that card was the bottom card of the cut pack. Once it's become clear through the bidding process who plays solo against the other two players, these three last cards, the stock or the monte, i.e. the hill in Italian, are turned face up for everyone to see, unless it was the dealer who decided to play solo, in which case they remain undisclosed to anyone but the dealer. The dealer has certain natural advantages in this game, as in many other tarot games, by the way. Irrespective of whether the cards of the stock were thus shown to everybody or just the dealer, the soloist picks them up and adds them to his hand. He must now discard any three cards face down he either deems unnecessary, or indeed cards of a higher point value, because they in fact constitute his first trick and are thus counted towards his overall sum of card points. There are, however, certain restrictions as to what may be discarded. One might be tempted to secure some of the highest pointers by discarding them. This is not permissible. No 5 or 10 point cards may ever be discarded, i.e. neither the 4 kings, nor the 5 highest trumps, nor trump number 1, nor the fool. Other trumps may only be discarded if the soloist has no other choice, and his hand therefore consists of only kings and trumps after the discard. In some tarot games, these exceptionally discarded trumps, or at least their number, have to be announced. Not so in Sicilian Tarot, but the aforementioned restriction still remains in power. Here we can see an example of a soloist's hand and the 3 discards, leaving the soloist with a good many of trumps, a few kings, and a somewhat longer suit that can serve as a conduit towards drawing trumps later in the game. It would be coins here. Remember, you have to trump if you cannot follow suit anymore. Conversely, the soloist should also strive to relieve himself of 1 or 2 suits entirely, so as to be able to catch points therein from the very get-go. In this case, the soloist hasn't got any battens or clubs. After the discard, but just before the very first card is played, some extra bids can be pronounced. We'll get to those in a minute when we'll finally view a conspectus of game points. Then, the person to the right of the soloist leads a card. To the right of the soloist, not necessarily the dealer, as opposed to common practice in other comparable games. Whereupon, we follow the usual trail of tricks, as we already saw earlier on. 3 cards are played to the table in an anti-clockwise fashion. The highest trump in the trick takes it. If there's no trump, the highest card in the suit that was led wins it. The winner of this trick turns it face down, gathers it up, leads to the next trick, and so on until all cards have been played. At which final point, both parties, the soloist versus his 2 opponents, gather up all the tricks they respectively took and count the card points they gathered altogether. This now brings us to the holy grail of game points. That is what the game is ultimately all about. As mentioned previously, the 2 primary goals of the game are firstly to take the majority of card points, that is at least 55, including 5 card points for the last trick, but also secondly taking the last trick in its own right. Therefore, there are 5 card points as well as 1 game point awarded to whoever took the last trick. This is crucial because the soloist might take the majority of card points, worth 1 game point altogether, but also lose the last trick, also worth 1 game point, in which case the soloist hasn't won anything at this point. 1 game point has been gained, but 1 also has to be paid. A zero-sum game, provided no other game points were made. I said earlier on that certain additional bids can be announced after the soloist's discard and just before the very first card has been played to the table. This is one of them. Only a person sitting between the soloist and the dealer in the direction of play, so behind the soloist, after the soloist, may announce that the last trick shall be worth 2 game points instead of just 1. This is usually possible if that person has got trump 20 or sufficiently long trumps to last him until the very last trick. Why somebody sitting in the round after the soloist? Well, we want to avoid a situation where a player passed on purpose and therefore tricked another player into proclaiming a solo, which the passer can now use to his advantage by effectively destroying the game, because he already knew he'd take the last trick. The aforementioned primary game points are by no means the only ones though. There are also game points for specific rummy-like card combinations a party will have gathered in their tricks. Those would be entire 2 game points for all top 5 trumps, 1 game point for quote-unquote just the trumps 16 through 19, the celestial bodies if you will. We'll also see a diagram in a few moments. And finally, 1 game point for taking all 4 kings. There is one last additional bid that can be uttered just before the first card has actually been played, and that would be the promise to have all 3 of the 10-point cards within one's final trick pile, i.e. the highest trump, trump number 20, then trump number 1, as well as the fool. The highest trump, number 20, and the fool cannot be taken, as we saw. Trump 1 can be though, so you should usually only bid this particular combination if you have sufficiently long trumps so as to bleed them all out until you can safely play trump number 1. Or you might think you get lucky, but that's gambling. In any case, the right to this special bid is reserved for the soloist alone. Last but not least, there are also game points awarded for the kidnapping of any pointy trumps from one's opponents. Look, there are only 5 non-empty trumps that can, in principle at least, be captured, thus taken by opponents. That's trump number 1 and trumps 16 through 19, worth 10 card points and 5 card points each, respectively. Any such card you take in a trick, provided it came from an opponent's hand, is worth an entire game point. In case you capture, say, 3 of them, you'll also be awarded 3 game points. If you just take a trick with one of them and there are no other cards you captured, you'll not gain a game point for that, but you'll thus also avoid the capturing of that card by the opponents. It's therefore highly likely that these 5 cards will be played early on in the game. So let's review the combinations in a somewhat more visual way. There are the 4 kings as well as the 3 10-pointers, with a caveat that the latter combination can and must only be announced by the soloist. It does not amount to a game point if it was not announced. The 4 kings do, however, as does the rest of the combinations. And those rest are the 4 trumps 16 through 19, which constitute a combination in their own right, or indeed all 5 trumps 16 through 20, worth entire 2 game points. Plus, the 4 trumps 16 through 19, as well as trump 1, can, in principle, also be captured by opponents, in which case the opponents gain 1 game point per captured card. And that's that. We've now seen all game points. All of these game points count doubly, thus also points one loses in case an early solo was bid, i.e. a solo proclaimed during the very first round of bidding after the very first 5 cards that were dealt to all 3 players. The only thing that remains for you to do now is to acquire a pack of Sicilian Tarot cards, recruit 2 other players and give it a go. A thorough English language description of the rules, including variants, can be found on pagat.com, an invaluable source of quite literally thousands of card games, past and present. Now a few additional words on the deck, because it's a very interesting and unique tarot deck. We can observe a few peculiarities typical of all tarot decks. They usually start with a few of the lowest as well as the highest social ranks. Beggars versus emperors, essentially. Then, we have a large block of 10 allegories spanning life, death, and the worlds beyond our kin and ken, culminating in either the world or the Angel of Judgment Day. These 10 allegories are interspersed with the 2 blocks of firstly, 3 of the 4 cardinal virtues, temperance, fortitude, justice, missing prudence, interestingly enough, and secondly, 3 celestial luminaries, the star, the moon, and the sun. Here in Sicily, the 3 virtues are an undivided block. We see them here on the screen, the trumps 5, 6, and 7. There's even a 4th virtue, constancy, usually not counted amongst the cardinal ones, and apparently a replacement of the earlier pope, who was removed on pious grounds. Some classical influences are also plain to see, Atlas and Jupiter, for example, instead of just the world and the Angel of Judgment Day. Tarot originated in northern Italy about 600 years ago, in the beginning of the 15th century. A deck still used in Bologna features one of the most undisturbed orders of the trumps. The 3 virtues are also undivided, trumps 7 through 9 in this case to be precise, and the 2 blocks of virtues and luminaries loom over the 10 allegories in a very symmetrical way. When the game of tarot moved south, for example to Florence, it changed rules and also the deck, quite considerably even. The virtues moved to the trump spots 6 through 8, dragging along the lovers and the wheel of fortune, and a large block of 20 new cards was introduced just before the luminaries, for the game of Germini, often called minchiate, although the latter is a dirty word in Italian. When this game moved even further south and reached Sicily, it was quite thoroughly redesigned, shortened again, and some of the previously out-jogged cards, such as the Wheel of Fortune, were in-jogged again, so as to form a symmetrical block around Death, always 13 in all tarot decks, still towered over by the 3 Virtues and the 3 Luminaries. But the different machinations with the deck again left the Virtues at slightly different spots, 5 through 7 this time around. Finally, the deck got a makeover. A new trump, 0, Misery, is introduced to get the trump count back to the original 21. The aforementioned Constancy acts as a replacement for the Pope, and the Devil has disappeared in favour of simply a ship, number 14. Some of the classical references we already touched upon, but there are also others, such as the scenes on the luminary cards, and much more. The hangman is hung from his neck, not his foot as in most other tarots. The tower is intact and serene, not crumbling as again in other tarots, etc., etc. In a word, very peculiar and worth exploring on your own, even if you won't find too many people to actually play the game with, which I very much hope you will though after having watched this video. And now a few final words on history. The most widely known arrangement of trumps is very, very different to the Sicilian one. It was heavily popularised by advocates for divination. Let's be honest, most people associate divination with tarot cards. Although they were specifically invented for games and only acquired the divinatory connection once French occultists rediscovered the pack of tarot cards as it used to be used in Marseille. And that happened around the French Revolution, so 400 years after the tarot saw the light of day. Therefore, most if not all divination decks are based exclusively on this very Tarot de Marseille as depicted here. The Pope is still there, but the 3 Virtues are scattered across the deck, punctuating the sequence after every 2 allegories. Yet another kind of symmetry, but distinctly different to the Sicilian one. And that's all, folks. I hope this video can awaken some eagerness in familiarising oneself with a hugely interesting topic of tarot games, as well as the decks they're played with. Cheers!